Okay. Hello and welcome to Aquarium Studies Volume 3. I am your host, pannobhasa, and I'm pretty much removing Dharma from the title of these from now on, I guess, unless I can think of something dharmic to discuss that I haven't discussed already, because there's not going to be a whole lot of Dharma or Buddhist philosophy or any such thing in this particular episode, other than, as always, some of the best Dharma to be had from a fish tank is just the mild meditation of sitting in front of the fish tank, just gazing upon it in silence. That is actually a very nice meditation, good meditation for beginners or for masters. So that's the Dharma. And the rest is going to be actually more ecology than Dharma, because the main topic of this episode, what has inspired me to discuss this episode, is the changes in ecosystems when certain species are added or are lacking. If they are present or not present, it can change the whole balance of the ecosystem. And so if you add a species to an already established aquarium, for example, then it's going to seek a new balance. It's going to, you add something that starts feeding on something else, which then can wipe out one species by adding a different species, and it just causes a whole different balance in the tank or in the little ecosystem. So I suppose I should just show you my aquarium. Trying to do the queasy cam too much this time. Go like this, doing it very smoothly. And then I got to remember to move the microphone also. And here is the tank. Got to get back a ways from it. It's kind of dim right now because it's in afternoon mode. You don't want too much bright light because then it causes the algae to go crazy. Although I actually do want a certain amount of algae in this tank. So I'm going to move this over a little bit. So there haven't been a whole lot of changes with regard to species, although there has been significant change in this tank since the last episode. If I remember correctly, right before I did the last episode, I had just added some of these here zebra loaches, Botia striata. And I already knew that in the wild, in their natural habitat, they specialize in eating snails. Like their whole snout is shaped in order to make it easier for them to eat snails. And that's Attila right there. Those are some dwarf gouramis of various sorts. Cherry barbs in the background there, those little red guys. But mainly, it's these zebra loaches, these stripy guys that specialize in eating snails. And before I put them in, I had lots of snails in this tank. I had two big mystery snails, one of them being Leroy Jenkins. I had two medium-sized nerite snails, and I had a whole bunch of little ram's horn snails. And within days of putting those zebra loaches into the tank, they immediately started being predators on the snails. The ram's horn snails were almost completely wiped out within a matter of days. The two large mystery snails that I had to relocate just closed up their operculum. They just went inside their shell and hid to get away from the loaches and were starving. They probably would have died of starvation if I hadn't rescued them. And the nerite snails are lasting longer. The loaches still get them sometimes. But a nerite snail, I don't know if there are any. There's one in the back. Yeah, I don't see any nerite snails. Maybe right up here in the corner. Let's see. There's a nerite snail right there in the corner there. And he's just kind of resting. But when they feed, they don't stick out feelers, little antennas or eye stalks or anything. So the loaches can't get at them as easily as other snails that are sticking feelers out, have a lot of meat sticking out past the shell. And so nerite snails are pretty much the only snails that have any chance of surviving in this tank after I added the zebra loaches, which caused the snail apocalypse. So what happened was, because the snails are gone, algae started really increasing in this tank. And you can see over there, I've got like the algae wall, which really wasn't there, or it was much smaller before the loaches came. Although this algae wall is actually shrinking now for various reasons. And also, if you look, let's see, right there, you can see sort of a gray fuzzy stuff growing on the top of that wisteria. That's a different species of algae. That's black beard algae. And it was just getting worse because the main algae eaters in this tank were snails, and adding the zebra loaches, those guys, which are very nice. I mean, I don't regret adding them or anything, but they just killed off what feeds on the algae. So the algae is just taking off. So I think it was yesterday, if I remember correctly, I got a new fish, which is right there. He's resting on that wood right there. He's a Siamese algae eater, which is one of the few species that you can get for an aquarium that feeds on that gray fuzzy algae, this stuff over here, although he hasn't gotten to it yet. He's already, where'd he go? No, there he is. So he's already been like grazing on algae, which is good, but he's just getting started, I think. And he's pretty small. It'll take him a while. I would have gotten more, but they get about 6 inches long when they're full grown. So I don't want to completely overwhelm this tank. You have to take that into account. A lot of people, when they buy a fish, they don't really study up on it first. They put it into the tank and then it grows 8 inches long, or it turns out that it feeds on something else in the tank that you like. So he has been already earning his keep here. And I hope he doesn't completely eat that algae wall there, that filamentous green algae, because Attila there, that blue dwarf gourami, he grazes on this algae wall a lot. He'll spend hours every day just grazing on this algae wall. And it may be that he's not eating very much of the algae, but he's eating the microorganisms that live on the algae, or, among the strands of this algae. So sometimes the nerite snails will get over there, and I think it's the nerites that are actually causing this algae wall to get gradually smaller. But I kind of like it there. Most of the other fishes that are grazing, like this red dwarf gourami, or that female dwarf gourami, they prefer this hornwort. They'll graze on that for hours every day, especially that female there, that brownish colored one. She just spends hours. She probably gets at least half of her food from this monstrous hornwort that grows about 1 inch a day and has to be trimmed back at least once a week. But for some reason, the blue male dwarf gourami, he almost always restricts his grazing to that little patch of algae there. There he is. That's Attila. And all the rest of the fish are pretty much the same. I did have a female betta or Siamese fighting fish in here for a while because my sweetheart got a male and a female, and she was trying to keep them in the same tank, and the male was just shredding the fins of the female. So she got put in here, but it turns out that they're mating right now. So I'll show you that tank before I'm done. But mainly the main interest here was just the drastic change in the balance of this tank by adding the zebra loaches, which are now hiding. They're now in the back. And they just wiped out the snails. It kind of reminds me of what happened when the sea otter was almost driven to extinction off the west coast of the United States. All of a sudden, the kelp forests disappeared. And the reason why the kelp forest disappeared is because the sea otters preyed on sea urchins, and the sea urchins ate kelp. So you get rid of the predator on the sea urchins explode, they have a population explosion, and then they just wipe out the kelp forest. So then when the sea otter started making a resurgence and coming back to its original population numbers, then the sea urchin population went back down again and the kelp forest came back. So you can see it's a bit more jungly. It's getting gradually more and more jungly. The only changes in the plants, other than they're getting bigger and the algae wall is I add a little bit of pearl weed down there. Let's see. There it is. I planted a little bit of pearl weed, which may or may not do very well. And over here, my suwaser tang is finally taken off. It's starting to grow well. And you can't see it very well, I guess. The tank's a little too dark right now. But it's sort of like a freshwater seaweed, although it's actually the gametophyte generation of a fern. And over on the other side, I had some suwaser tang, but it's almost completely gone. It's completely dwindled away, whereas this one is actually getting big. So I'm not exactly sure what the reason of that is. But that's this tank. The algae eaters are still in there, but they've been disappointing. I guess Otocinclus. I had some Otocinclus algae eaters in here because they didn't have Siamese algae eaters when I went to buy algae eaters the first time. And they just cannot keep up. They got a low metabolic rate. They don't need to eat very much, apparently. Whereas the Siamese algae eater, which, he's in the back there. That guy, he's got a high metabolic rate. So he's eating pretty much all day long. And that's pretty much the case with the zebra loaches too. They've got a higher metabolic rate, which leads to sort of a complication of how much to feed these guys, because the gouramis and the red guy, he's like the king, he's being territorial. And also the cherry barbs, I mean, it's hardly even necessary to feed them because they can forage on biofilm and microfauna in this tank and get enough to eat. Whereas these zebra loaches that are down there somewhere, yeah, they're being camera shy now. The zebra loaches are just very active, and they require more food. And so there's a trick of making sure these guys get enough food, whereas the cherry barbs especially don't just become obese and diabetic. So you compare the algae in this tank with these fish. You got the green algae there. You got some diatoms growing in the sand down there. You got the gray beard algae back there. There's several different species of algae. Probably the grayish hue of this hornwort, the older parts of it, may also be a certain amount of this black beard algae. And then some of it's just like detritus, like water dust that lodges in the little tendrils there, filaments or whatever. So there's a lot of algae in this tank, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I do like a certain amount of algae because it provides food for other organisms, provides a habitat for microorganisms, which then provides food for organisms and so forth. So like I said, I hope that this the patch of algae growing on the wall doesn't completely go away. It is getting smaller. It'll probably get a lot smaller now that I got put a Siamese algae eater in there. See, he seems to be taking somewhat of an interest in that over there also. But you compare this mass of algae in this jungly tank, and then I come over here to my invertebrate tank. Let's see, gotta make the transition here. So let's see. Okay. So here's the invertebrate tank. Just a little 10-gallon tank, no fish in it at all. It's got plants, it's got invertebrates, and it's got approximately zero algae. There's almost no algae at all growing in this tank. And the easiest explanation for why the other tank is so full of algae, and this one has almost zero, is that this tank has no fish. And so the creatures that are eating the algae in this tank are food for the fish. So you don't have any fish, and then you've got lots of little snails. Like, let's see, you got one on the wall right there. There's one on kind of a larger ram's horn snail on the Buddha's head right there. You look around, there's all kinds of little snails in here. And there's a shrimp on the wisteria in the back there, a red one. And everything except for the shrimp would be eaten. Possibly the shrimp also would be eaten by those loaches in the other tank. And strangely, even though this tank is 1/3 the size of my big tank and it has no fish in it, I put at least 4 times as much food into this tank. I put like a piece of banana into this tank yesterday, and it was completely gone this morning. And one of the reasons for that is amphipods. I got lots of the population of gammarid amphipods in this tank is very much increasing, and I don't think you'll be able to see any because they're mostly nocturnal and they hide during the day. They're very good at hiding, but I would not be surprised if there are several dozen of these little green crustaceans, smaller than the shrimps. There's a red shrimp there. There's a red shrimp there. They're maybe full grown. They're maybe a quarter the size of that. But there's lots of them. And they just hide. They're hiding under the leaves, for example. They hide in the hornwort. They're kind of a greenish color, so they're camouflaged. And I am happy to say that my shrimps have started reproducing. So there are also a bunch of baby shrimp in here that I don't think the camera is really strong enough that you'd even see one. If I found one in here, see, I can look around, but yeah. There are still the little detritus worms. See the little kind of blurry white specks on the glass. Some of those anyway are little annelid worms that feed on detritus. I still have a few of the larger black worms living in the substrate here, although there's a lot fewer of them and they're so small that the camera really can't see them. But you can see that the main kind of organism living in this tank, at least that is obvious, are these just baby snails everywhere, little snails, which their lifespan, if you drop them into the other tank with the loaches, I mean, they do not survive for very long at all. The loaches are just all over them like white on rice. So that's kind of an interesting, at least to me, it's interesting. The ecological balance is different just from having fish or not having fish. It's just different species are able to thrive with different predators or lack of predators. And so you wind up with a completely different balance. It's largely just a matter of what you choose to put in there or what accidentally gets in there. There are a few accidental additions of species into this tank. There's at least one leech that came with some blackworms one time, some live blackworms. So there's still a leech in here. He doesn't suck blood. I think he feeds on little detritus worms or something. And maybe he's feeding on the larger annelid worms because the population of larger annelid worms has very much decreased. So that's that tank. And with regard to my sweetie's favorite tank, her specialty tank, let's see if I can move this. There hasn't been a whole lot of change in this tank. It's pretty much the same as it was before. She's got the Lake Tanganyika Mbuna cichlids there, the blue ones and the yellow ones. The yellow ones are female. There's also a beta male that turns himself female in order to avoid competition with the blue alpha male right there, the blue guy with the stripes. And her plants are just taking off. They're doing much better than the plants in my main tank, mainly because she's got a layer of soil under her sand. And I didn't realize, I didn't study up enough to know that I should put a layer of sand underneath my sand, or a layer of soil underneath my sand. But she knew to do that before she got started. And so there's some catfish, some Plecostomus, and also some Corydoras catfish that have been put into this tank since the last video, and they just hide all the time, mainly hiding from these cichlids, which can be relatively aggressive. And you've also got relatively aggressive tiger barbs in here. So they mostly are hiding behind this. There's like this rock cave thing that I think a lot of them, they spend most of their time just behind the cave thing where they don't get harassed by semi-aggressive fish. And so the last thing will be, if I can do this, I don't know if my cord is long enough. Yeah, my cord's all tangled up, and so this might be a trick. But I'll go over here, turn on the light. And let's see, maybe we can do this. If I just pick up the whole computer and go over this way. Okay. So this is a little 6-gallon. Oh, wait. I gotta move the microphone also. This is fun. This is kind of tricky here. All right. So this is the little 6-gallon tank that probably wasn't well set up in the last video. And the centerpiece fish, so to speak, is that like white betta, Siamese fighting fish. And he got fed brine shrimp yesterday. And so today he was feeling frisky and was mating with a blue female who's in there somewhere. She's probably hiding in the bushes to get away from him because he just shreds her fins sometimes. And he's got a bubble nest in here, but let's see if we can see it. There's the bubble nest. And so there are actually eggs in that little nest of bubbles there. There we go. There are little betta eggs in there. And so the blue female should probably be taken out because he'll become very territorial, keeping everything away from his babies. For some reason, he ignores these endlers, which are a kind of dwarf guppy. So those are kind of like the little dither fish to add a little distraction. And that's pretty much all that's in this tank other than snails and so forth. So I don't know if the babies are going to survive. Will be the second time that the bettas mated. And the first time the babies didn't survive, although partly it was just, in my opinion, they just didn't have enough food. It was a relatively new tank, not really set up with microorganisms and so forth. So there is that. And so I'm going to gradually move everything. Sorry about this. But I have to move things around in order to get as far as that betta tank, especially because the cords are all tangled up. So I just put this back here, if at all possible. This is so much fun. Oh, here we go. All right. Okay. So that was just mainly what I was interested in showing, is just how the ecosystem of an aquarium or any ecosystem can change just from the introduction of a new species or the extinction of an old species. It can cause the entire balance to shift. Although, as a general rule, unless something gets really out of whack, then there's always going to be a balance. So you add a new species, somehow remove an old species. Let's see, I gotta plug the computer back in. And it's just gonna cause a shift in like a different direction until another equilibrium, like a new equilibrium, is reached. And that's the way the whole world is acting, which causes me, to some degree, to be less concerned about climate change, etc., than a lot of people, simply because I know that life is very tenacious, that life always finds a way to continue living. That's one of the things about life, is that it adapts and actually responds to the environment, responds to stimuli, and makes adjustments in many cases to help it to survive and reproduce. And so that's what's happening in my tank. And I hope the next time I do a video with regard to my aquarium and its evolution over time, the evolution of the ecosystem within the aquarium, that there will be less of that gray fuzz algae growing on my plants, because I hope that my new Siamese algae eater will take care of it. And I guess that's enough for now. So be happy.